chào thầy Phúc, chào em Giang, chào em Hương, chào anh Tuấn, chào Khương, chào cô Phương.
Anh Hải ơi.
Chưa đó là
Alo, chào cả nhà.
Sorry.
Chào thầy Tuấn.
Chào anh Hải. Anh có cái hình đẹp quá. Cái này là chỗ nào anh? Thì hôm nào giới thiệu cả lớp đến chụp hình anh.
Nói với em Hương nè, em Hương là ban tổ chức sau này hội thảo ở FLC, không biết FLC đâu, FLC Hạ Long hay gì đó.
FLC nó nhiều lắm anh, không biết là chỗ nào. Hay mình đi cái chỗ hoa tam giác mạch đi, ở cao nguyên đá Đồng Văn anh.
Cao nguyên đá Đồng Văn, đúng rồi. Chứ vừa rồi thấy có mấy thầy cô như thầy gì đó, thầy gì ông Tuốt ở trên Thái Nguyên á.
Vâng.
thầy gì đó, thầy ẩn. Trời ơi, ông đi từ đó xuống cực quá, mà giờ
Nhưng mà
mình
cái
đi lên.
mùa này thì chưa có hoa tam giác mạch này.
Chào thầy Phúc.
Chào anh Tuấn Nguyễn. Anh Tuấn Nguyễn ơi.
Chào cả nhà.
Đi đâu rồi anh?
Ăn sáng.
Sao hôm nào mình gặp nhau hả?
Lịch có thứ
Phát
hai,
à?
lịch có thứ hai,
Phát ơi.
thứ bảy, không chủ nhật, không có ngày chủ nhật, không có bữa nào.
Được, ok. Em ấy cho anh cái chat mà để anh em mình có thể chat được trên Zoom ấy.
Có thầy Phát bữa nay anh Thăng, chào anh Thăng phiên dịch những đơn vị thầm lặng. Chào anh Phát phiên dịch, không biết hôm nay ai phiên dịch nữa. Cảm ơn Phát nhiều nha, vừa rồi cứu giùm mình một vụ phiên dịch thứ tiếng Tây Ban Nha.
Okay, let's start today's program on survey instruments. And look, I'm sure many of you use survey instruments a lot in the course of your work. So what we're showing you today is really the AIS model and the AIS approach and how we do things in Australia. And there may be some similarities and there may be some differences. And we'll get to do a group exercise later this morning when we can explore what some of those things are. But if you remember yesterday, I asked you to think of if you could only ask one question in a survey, if you only had a one question survey to design, what would that question be? I want you to think about that question now. When we do the group exercise later on, I want you to tell me what those questions are. And I also want you to tell me if, after what we've heard this morning, have you changed your question? Has your question changed as a result of anything that you've heard this morning? So let's keep that in mind as we go forward. Let's start with really the evolution of survey instruments. I've said to you previously that we probably are using survey instruments in our Australian model less than we have previously. And there's a reason for that, because we've really built a very sophisticated and detailed model of data collection. And survey instruments are probably most useful for telling us things about what's planned to happen. And that's not more so than what's happening presently. Of course, they can be used for that purpose, but their main value for us in an industry intelligence model is to try and predict what's planned and what is on the horizon, maybe also what is intended to happen, because of course what's planned and what does happen don't always correlate. So we can use survey instruments to give us a forward projection, a forward look at how things might be evolving in the planning and investment environment of enterprises, in anticipating new skills demand and new work processes, because from new work processes will come potentially new skills development needs. So they're useful for that. They're useful complementary research tools. They are partnered with other qualitative methods to give us the ability to look at issues in some detail. So I have said to you before that we tend to use survey instruments to identify key issues, key themes, and we will then use other qualitative methods like focus groups or key informant interviews to go into the detail of those issues. So we can pick up trends from survey data, and we can then explore the detail behind them using other instruments. So they're a good, I guess, lead instrument in a data collection system. And that's really the way that we tend to be using them. It's probably fair to say that, increasingly, we're probably asking less and less questions in our surveys. We don't tend to try and use sort of long, exhaustive surveys. That's very problematic, and we'll look at that a little bit more in a few minutes. But, our survey instruments are very short, very focused. And I think that's one of the key things we need to think about for the Vietnam model, is we want an instrument which is very focused. Really, we're talking about a survey tool, a research tool that can give us a point in time view of a sector. What's happening now and what's happening or planned to happen in the future. They really have good value in that sense, particularly around things that we are anticipating, change that's being anticipated, technology, capital investment, skills and work processes that are evolving in enterprise environments. Of course, we don't just use them to survey enterprises. They can be used to survey other stakeholder groups. I am using the example of enterprises because I suspect in our case, in your case, that will be the focus of your initial survey instruments. Okay, so that's the use of them. What value do they have? Well, there's one key element of a survey instrument which is really important when we're doing research, and that is it gives us control of the research inquiry. We can set the research inquiry. We can't do that with lots of other instruments. We're bound by data that's been produced by primary sources. We're looking at secondary, interpretive, narrative sources. We can't control that research agenda, but we can with surveys. And that is a very important element of why surveys have a place in this spectrum. We can be very specific about the type of information we want to ask, and we can be very specific about who we want to answer the questions. Now, we can be specific about who we want to answer the questions, but we may not necessarily be able to control who answers the questions. So we can also be specific about when we ask our questions. And this is going to be particularly important when we look at timelines and timing, because we need to remember that business investment decisions, business planning tends to run on a cycle, tends to operate over a business cycle. So the timing of our surveys can be really influential on the type of data we get if we ask at certain times of the business cycle. So this is something we need to keep in mind at the moment, because we've seen massive disruption caused by COVID-19. Enterprises are in the main not likely to be operating to their full capacity or under their normal processes. So if we were to conduct a survey of enterprises at this point in time, those results and findings would be influenced by the business operating environment, which is a disrupted one, which for some firms is a very chaotic one at the moment. So we will get data that will reflect what's happening at this point in time. So we do need to be careful that the timing of our survey matches what we want to understand. We'll talk about this a little bit more in a few minutes when we get onto timelines, but I want you to be really clear about this. The timing of the survey is something we can control and is something that you need to think about when you're planning to administer a survey instrument. We're dealing with a very dynamic, fast-changing sector. We're dealing with investment decisions. We're dealing with the business cycle, the start and the end of the financial year. We need to be cognizant and aware of how those elements of the cycle can influence the type of information we'll receive and the type of questions we can ask. So if we're operating with a survey instrument that's targeted towards enterprises, the timing of our instrument is important to understand. The other key, I guess, attraction of survey instruments is the ability to make them anonymous. So this is important when we're trying to get access to what you'd probably consider to be sensitive information, maybe commercial information, particularly when we're talking about investment decisions, technology change. You know, companies are naturally very guarded sometimes about this information. This has a competitive advantage for some firms. So, you know, again, making the informant, the respondent, anonymous can allow us to ask probably more searching questions without the need to actually identify the respondent. This will give us a greater response rate. The evidence suggests by blinding identification of respondents, so that is that we don't see necessarily the specific respondent in the data. It's a useful way of dealing with sensitive and commercial information, and it can give more confidence to the respondent to frankly and openly express their views. And that's what we want. We want integrity and honesty in the data. We can't do some of these things with other data collection methods. You know, secondary data research, obviously not. Statistical data, we can't anonymize that. Industry forums, you know, we're not anonymizing respondents in that, but we can do it with surveys. And it's really important because it's an important element of why they're attractive to people, because they feel that they can express their views without any potential consequence. So we're able to capture very specific data. We can set that agenda. We can ask questions about what is planned for the future. We're able to, you know, identify key issues that can be further explored. Survey instruments are very good for identifying issues, maybe even trends, that we can then look in more detail through other methods. And over time, if we have a good survey instrument, it can be repetitive. And we could administer that survey on a regularized basis, asking the same questions. And we could use that to measure change over time, a longitudinal measure of change. So we've got lots of ways we can apply survey instruments. Some of the challenges with them, well, as I'm sure many of you who have been active in surveying previously will appreciate, getting a response to surveys is not always easy. And we had a very good question from Ms. Dio Ling yesterday about payments for surveys. And it's often tempting to think that we can increase the response rate by paying people to complete surveys, but we risk compromising the data. The motivation for completing surveys should not be driven by financial outcomes. That's not the motivation that we want from respondents. We want verifiable information that's given on the basis of faith and trust. In other words, they have faith that we can use this information well, and they trust our ability to make this information valuable. So that's how we compel completion. So one of the challenges, I guess, is it's hard sometimes to get a high response rate. That's not unusual with surveys. They can be time consuming, and we need to make sure that whatever instrument we're using is convenient. We'll talk about this in a minute, but what I mean by that is it's easy for the respondent to complete it. We make it as easy as possible for the respondent to complete the survey. We put it in a format which they're comfortable with. Maybe we do it online. Maybe we use an online portal like SurveyMonkey. We make it as easy as possible to try and increase that response rate, to try and minimize the time required to participate. But the other thing we need to remember about surveys, and particularly the type of surveys that we are likely to be designing, they're not representative. And we shouldn't be trying to make them representative. I mean, that's not really what we're using them for. We're not looking for an effective sampling of the sector. We don't need to do that necessarily. Maybe as this model evolves over time and as it becomes more resourced and sophisticated, that's something that may be of interest. But at the moment, it's not something that we need to be concerned about, the representative sampling of our survey instrument. What we do need to be aware of is the limitations of a non-representative sample and how we can express the conditions and limitations of our research based on the respondents. It does lead to the question, though, of, what do we want to use this survey for? What would the LIRC want to use this survey instrument for? So I think that's really the key question in my mind, is what are we trying to find out here? But we'll get to that in a minute. For the moment, let's just look at the key principles of effective surveying. And I think it's fair to say we've got to give the respondent a reason to participate in the survey. This is the key driver of encouraging a high response rate. What is in it for you to complete this survey? Why do we want this data? And what do we want it for? We have to explain this. And every survey instrument that we administer must be sent to respondents with a very clear message about why we're doing this research and what we intend to do with it. This is the way we get their buy-in. We get their commitment because they can see, this might have value for me. They're looking at skills development needs across the logistics sector. That's something my company's interested in. If I complete this survey and they send me the results, I can see this has got value. And that's how we compel, well, not compel, but I guess encourage participation in our survey instrument. We've got to give them the sell. We've got to sell the sizzle, as we say in English. We have to give them a motivation, an attraction to this. We need to determine a sampling method. Now, we just talked about the fact that we're not likely to be doing, a sampling which is representative. We don't need to. But when we do use a non-representative sample, we do need to make sure that we disclose that limitation in our findings. So, for example, if we did a survey of 50 logistics enterprises, then in our findings, our conclusions, we would be saying something like, according to a survey of 50 logistics enterprises, these are the findings. Or you know, 1/4 of 100 respondents to our survey said this. This is how we caveat and give limitations to our survey tools. So it's important that we recognise the limitations of whatever sampling method we use. We don't need to get into error rates and that level of detail, I don't believe, with our survey tools. But as we evolve over time, you know, we may wish to start using these instruments for, you know, collection of quantitative data, and we may need to start looking at some form of sampling and therefore the error rate that will come from that process, depending on what we're trying to understand. It all goes back to that fundamental question of what's the research question? Ask the right questions. I'm saying in English, write the right questions. So you need to draft the right questions. This is the really hard bit of surveys. How do we get the questions right? And when Kevin joins us a little bit later, you know, he'll be able to help us understand some of the tricks, some of the challenges. I think one of the biggest problems I see with survey instruments is one question per question. We only want to ask one question per question. It's often evident that we seem to be asking more than one question within a question. And that causes confusion with the respondent, and it causes difficulty in disaggregating the response in terms of a data set. So we need to be careful about that. One question per question, make it very clear what we're asking, and be brief. No long questions. People don't want to participate in surveys when they see lots of very long, wordy questions. Be convenient, so provide a very easy way to complete the survey. In my work, I'm increasingly going online with survey instruments because I think they are the universal access. And this is something that we need to keep thinking about in our program. You know, we've got Ms. Bickfung with us from DRD. We've been doing a lot of work with the Disability Research Centre. You know, we need to make sure that our survey instruments are accessible for people from all walks of life, able-bodied, disabled, people with sight impairment, hearing impairment. We need to think about these things. We want to be as accessible as possible. So accessibility is really important, and it's part of the convenience element of a survey. Be consistent. There's nothing more infuriating than going through a survey and finding different tenses, language being swapped around, or different terminology being used. Really want to avoid that. It does confuse the respondent about what the question is actually asking. So we need to be very clear about the consistency of our language choices. Okay. So things to consider in a survey design. Now I'll say right up front that we have in our SharePoint folder, we have loaded a couple of tools, survey tools. We have a checklist in there for drafting good survey questions, and we have a checklist on how to commission, design, and run a survey. Now, these are tools that you can take and use and give you some guidance around survey design. They come from some United Nations manuals on survey design. And I've done a lot of work with UN agencies, the International Labour Organization and International Office of Migration and the OECD. And I think they produce excellent training manuals and technical manuals. And I would encourage you, if you are looking for more guidance, technical guidance, then these organizations, the OECD, for example, which is where I've got the material for the manuals I've developed for you, they have an excellent publication on surveys. And I would encourage you to look at that. Available in lots of different languages too. So that might give you access to some material in Vietnamese, which will help. But I can't stress enough the importance of planning. We plan to succeed. If we get the planning right, we will develop a useful instrument. we must invest in planning. And the first thing we must be clear about is, why are we doing this? What is the research question? We must have a starting research question. You know, it really is an essential element of everything we do, that we must start with a very clear understanding of what are we trying to find out. If we are surveying for the sake of trying to find information, then we're going to get a lot of stuff that we don't understand. We're going to get a lot of material that we can't make sense of. We can't classify, categorize. We want to be very clear up front. Why are we doing this? What's the purpose? We want to be able to use a mix of open and close-ended questions. It's important because they really have very different types of functionalities. You know, if we want to test something, if we want to test something we think we know or we believe we know, then, you know, close-ended questions are useful for that. We can pose a number of alternatives and we can see where the majority of opinion lies about something. If we want to get, if we want to find out something we don't know at all, then open-ended questions are useful. So why is this happening? What is the reason for this? Why do you feel that X, Y, and Z are important? Open-ended questions can give us an insight into things that we don't know much about already. So those are I'd say the two distinctions between the use of closed and open-ended questions, but a good survey instrument will probably have, you know, a balance of those two types of questions. And it's fair to say in most of our, the survey tools I've seen in AIS, you know, we tend to have a lot of closed-ended questions and some open-ended questions. Again, it's about time and convenience. We don't want to have too many open-ended questions unless you know that the respondent has a very strong interest in expressing views about that research topic. It obviously takes more time to complete open-ended questions. Reaching the right respondent. Well, this is really one of the big challenges for us. And let's be clear about whose knowledge we need to know. Who are we trying to get the information from? Now, in our case, you know, if we're talking about what's happening at the enterprise level, then we're probably trying to target job role supervisors, managers, enterprise managers, maybe even general managers. If we want to know what's happening in terms of work process, we may well be trying to talk to people in the job role. So actual labourers, workers in the actual job function. We need to be clear about who we're trying to get the information from, who we want the information from, who we want to get the opinion of, and how can we control it? How can we quality control who responds to our survey? The answer to that is in the distribution. It's in the distribution. Now, again, if we're trying to get a very specific type of respondent, then we need to think about what's the best method of distribution. Should we be doing this as an emailed questionnaire directly to the source, so we can email it directly to the person that we want to complete it? If it's more generalized in terms of a number of people have the knowledge that we're seeking, then online surveys where anyone can access the survey tool, that might be more suitable. But when we have a very specific respondent that we're targeting, we need to have a specific distribution mechanism so that we can get to the right person. Because what we don't want is to have the survey completed by someone who doesn't have knowledge of the issues. And I have said a number of times, you know, we want the general manager to complete it, but he gives it to the secretary to complete because he doesn't have time, or he's too, you know, he's got other things he needs to do. That's a risk for us. So how we distribute the survey is important too. And that goes to the next thing about modalities. Do we do this by an email exchange? Do we do this through an online platform? Again, remember, we want to make this low threshold, which means we want to make it as easy as possible to complete. That's really what we're aiming for. Timing. is something that we really need to think about. And Kevin may have some more views on this when he comes to join us, because, you know, if we're going to be dealing with enterprises, if we're largely going to be surveying in the first instance our enterprise partners, then, you know, they've got a lot of things on at the moment. They're dealing with COVID-19. They're trying to, in many cases, save or recover their business model. So we don't want to be imposing additional burden, or worse, getting information which isn't really going to tell us the true operational environment of the firm, because they're in a different mode of operation. If we were to administer a survey today to enterprises in Vietnam or even in Australia, we would get a very different picture of business activity to what we would have got 1 year ago, when there was a much more normalized business environment. So be careful about proposing to administer surveys in disruptive or abnormal business environments. That's a real risk. It's going to tell us stuff that is not likely to be as useful as we would get in a normalized operating environment. If we're at the end of the business cycle and we're asking questions about investment decisions, again, we may be missing out on important information. So the timing of our survey instrument is critical. When's the best time to survey that organisation? What part of the business cycle makes sense? And if we're surveying colleges, well, they have a different cycle of activity. They have a start and end of semesters. So if we want to get some information about enrolment rates, if we want to get information about completion rates, how many students have completed this course in logistics, how many dropped out, what happened to the graduates, how many went on to gain employment. Well, we want to be asking those questions at the right time of the calendar year, the semester cycle. So the timing is critical. We really must think about all of these elements. You know, they are all highly influential on the success of our survey. The last issue is ethics. Now, this is a really important issue, and it was raised by one of our members yesterday about the ethics of surveys. Now, there's some very clear principles around survey tools. We need to make sure we've got informed consent from our respondent. That means that the respondent knows why we're doing the survey, what we're going to do with the survey results, and that they are agreeable to participating. And in many cases, we get a written agreement from them. In fact, in many of the survey instruments that I've been administering over time, we've been required to get written consent from respondents to say, I'm happy to do this survey. I'm happy for this information to be used. So we must get informed consent. We must have voluntary participation. We don't want people completing the survey under sufferance. They must be voluntary in their participation. We must respect confidentiality. Many times I've been involved in surveys where respondents have said, yeah, I'd like to tell you something, but I don't want to be identified as the source of it. And often in survey tools and instruments, we would say, we give you an assurance that anything that you say in this conversation will not be shared with anyone else. We're not going to share what you said with our next interviewee. I'm not going to go into the next discussion and say, you know, Mr. Hai said about Mr. Tuan that he thinks he doesn't know what he's talking about. That's not what we're going to be using that information for. So we must give an assurance that we will protect confidentiality and we will respect anonymity. If our survey instrument is set to be an anonymous tool, we must respect that. And again, it's a useful way of encouraging greater frankness and openness in respondents. We often get asked, how long should it take to complete the survey? We actually get asked this a lot. And we're going to look at this a little bit more in a second, but it's a really good question. How long should we keep our survey instrument open for? How long should it take to complete the survey? These are really interesting things that we need to consider. So when we go to the timing around this, the timing, we've talked about how long will it take. Actually, there's some very good data around on the average time to complete a survey. And what the data says is that most respondents will complete the survey tool within 1 week, within 7 days. You get about maybe 1/3 of respondents completing it within 1 to 3 days, and you probably get about 1/2 to 2/3 of respondents completing it within 7 days. This is what evidence, the international evidence built around survey tools tells us. By the end of 2 weeks, you've probably reached the maximum of response rates. So if you haven't got responses from certain respondents within 2 weeks, the evidence suggests you're unlikely to get a response after that date. So we're really generally sort of looking at around a 2-week timeline. The evidence says that that's probably around the maximum that we should expose survey instruments to respondents for. Of course, we do and we should follow up on our survey tools. We should send a reminder email, a reminder message to respondents, post a reminder message that the survey is open for 1 more week. Can you please complete the survey within the next 7 days, as we will be closing the survey tool at that time. Reminders are important. I mean, people are busy, and some people that probably have the intention to complete the survey may put it as a lesser priority within their work. But if they get reminded of the need for it, and if we can then again articulate why we want this, then we can get more responses. But you know, generally around 2 weeks. How long does it take? When is a good time? Well, we talked about the business cycle and some of the steps. Now, the key steps that I've got there are very basic, but in the toolkit that I've posted for you, you know, it goes through in more detail sequentially, all the process steps you should undertake. So have a look at those tools in the SharePoint. They'll give you some insight into the timing issue. And just finally, before we break to have a discussion, maintaining quality. We need to make sure that we have, you know, a good quality control system around our instruments. We need to make sure that we can check that the instrument is logical. And what I mean by that is the sequencing of questions. And Kevin will probably talk about this in his presentation, but the order of our questions can strongly influence the response, the type of responses and the response rate. So the ordering of our questions is important. The wording of our questions is important. We should always pre-test. We should always take the time to pre-test. We should think about the sampling that we're using and disclose that sampling. We need to have good research skills within our team. This is another key quality element. We have to have good quality research capacity. We can collect a lot of information, but if we can't make sense of it, we don't know what to do with it, then we're wasting everyone's time. So quality control also goes to the technical skills that are needed. And we also need to make sure we store and house our data well. Now, next Tuesday, when I show you the AIS data analysis and interpretation system, you're going to see how important data storage is and some of the tools that we use. We've got a software tool that we use for data storage. It's really quite an amazing tool because it saves us a lot of time and it saves a lot of error. And the biggest problem with survey data is classification, coding of the data, and storing the data. And if we get that wrong, we're not going to be able to draw accurate conclusions and findings from our data. So really important that we do have good quality around our storage system, but we'll talk a lot more about that on next Tuesday. Okay, I want to do an exercise now. I want to break into our Zoom breakout rooms because I want you to return to that question that we started with today. What is the one question you could ask in a survey tool? So you might be thinking, well, I hope some of you are thinking, hang on a moment, he hasn't said who we're surveying. So if you've thought that, you get an extra point for thinking that. Let's assume we're surveying enterprises. Let's assume that we're going to be surveying enterprises. So let's think about what it is that we need to know. What are we trying to find out? Are we interested in labour demand, work process, technology and capital investment? Are we interested in something else? How people do things? What's happening with graduates once they enter the enterprise environment? And what informants do we need to target the survey towards? I think what we'll do now is let's break into our groups and I'd like you to come up with a survey question within your group. And you may have a couple and that's fine, but let's come up with a survey question within our group. And then when we return, I'm going to give you maybe, let's see, maybe 10 or 12 minutes to do this. When we come back, I want to hear what the question is. And I hope when we return, we might have Kevin O'Leary with us and he can start to help us understand how effective, I guess, our question design might be. So let me set up these breakout rooms. We've got quite a few participants with us today, so we'll have 5 rooms. I'm allocating you into the rooms now. I'm opening the rooms, so please go and join your groups, and we'll make this about 10 or 12 minutes long, and then we'll come back and have a quick discussion on what your primary survey question might be. Okay, folks, we might start coming back now. I'll start to close the rooms, and we can reconvene for a discussion. Okay, good. Okay, very good. Everyone's back. Thank you very much for participating in that group work. Let's mix it up a bit today, and let's hear from breakout room 2 first of all. So we had Miss Zhang from Vietnam Shipping Gazette. We had Miss Phum from Ho Chi Minh City College of Economics. You were in that group. Would one of you like to tell us what question you come up with?
Em sẽ thay mặt nhóm trình bày ạ.
On behalf of our team, I would like to present the group discussion results. So this, if we have only one question to answer an enterprise, and this is the questions that we would like to ask, and we have 2 options for them as answers. So at present, what is your business line? First is technology. Second is the skills, finance, process, and other choices. And for other choices, would you please elaborate on the choices? So, and now we would like to share a little bit about the process. How do we come up with this question? First one. Well, at the beginning, we discuss about an open-ended question or yes/no question. Like you can only choose yes or no for your answer. But the open-ended questions and the yes/no questions do not match in the case that we are allowed to ask only one question. Because a yes/no question is a confirmation, a question for confirmation question. And so in case we have only one question, we cannot use yes/no question. If we use open-ended question is a good solution, but it is only good for a small group of respondents. But if we have a large group of respondents, it is very hard to analyze because we don't see any focus in an open-ended questions. So finally, we go with a multiple choice question. And at first, we thought of only one option as answer, so they can choose either of the options. But then the 3 of us agree finally that they can choose many options as answers. Like they can choose 2 options as answers for this question. Yeah. So that is our process of thought. Thank you. My team, please.
Yes, Mr. Phúc, you'd like to go next?
Qua thảo luận thì nhóm em thống nhất là theo
Well, the discussion, we follow the Maslow pyramid. If we can only choose one question, this is the questions that we would like to ask, like what is your demand? because in this question we will collect a lot of data for later analysis. If it is a yes/no questions, then we can gather just a little bit of information, and it's really hard to decide what to do next. So we go with an open-ended question for this. Thank you.
Very good, Mr. Phuc. Thank you very much. And thanks for volunteering to go next. Look, this is interesting. Again, a very broad question being asked here. So let's carry on. Let's keep getting the questions from the groups, and we'll then have a talk about the various questions that we come up with. What about group 4? That had Miss Bích Phương in it, and Miss Hương from VCCI, and Mr. Gam Tuan. Would one of you like to tell us what question you come up with?
Đại diện nhóm 4 thì gồm
So on behalf of team 4, including me from VCCI, Mr. Cẩm Tuấn from corporate, and Ms. Phương from DRD. This is our response to your questions, and if we can only set up only one questions for data collection, this is our open-ended question.
nhân viên,
like what are the skills under the impact or under the influence of changes because of technology, and what is your solution?
Very good.
nhóm 4 xin hết ạ.
Yeah, over.
Very good. Very good. Thank you. And look, this is good because we're starting to hear your thinking around, one, what it is that we want to be researching, and two, what sorts of questions we want to be asking about the research. So let's keep going, because this is useful for us to understand your level of, I guess, thinking about the type of questions and information that we're trying to get here. So this is a good start. Let's go to group 1 now. And in that group we had Mr. Bao, Mr. Hai, and Ms. Chung from VCCI, and Mr. Tuan from Tu Duc College. Can I have one of you please tell us what question you come up with?
Thì kính thưa các anh chị, thì cái nhóm 1 thì có cái quan điểm khác, không có trả lời trực tiếp.
Hello. We didn't answer directly the questions set to us, given to us by Darren, because we believe that it must start from the purpose of this survey, and we must know the purpose of this survey, so we cannot decide a yes/no questions on open-ended questions to collect all of the data to meet our requirements. So this is what we discussed. So in any case of survey and data collection, we should have closed-ended questions and open-ended question. For closed-ended question, we will collect the convenient data for data analysis. But for open-ended questions, we can collect a lot of data from different perspectives, but it creates a lot of challenges in data analysis. So in a questionnaire or a survey, we should have from 1 to 2 open-ended questions, not too many open-ended questions, because the information or the data we collect back it pose great challenges for us to analyze. So we don't have any single questions to answer to you.
Yeah, look, I'm very impressed, Mr. Tuan. I'm very impressed with what you had to say there. You've been listening, your group has been listening very closely to what I've been saying. I like the way you responded to this issue. You're right. We don't have a research question. We don't have a hypothesis. I gave you a little hint when I said earlier, let's assume that we're asking enterprises this question, because we hadn't even specified who we're asking. So I think what you've said is very clever and very well made. It's not to say that we can't think up research questions, but we're fumbling in the dark if we don't know what our research inquiry is. So I think the point you make is a very, very good one. We need to take a step back before we think about how we're going to collect the information. Let's start with a research question. And I fully commend Group 1 on that response. That was excellent. So one more group. Group 3, Miss Hue was in that group. Mr. Viet, I think, was in that group. Mr. Mun, Miss Ning. Anyone from that group like to tell me what their question might be?
Em nói chị Huế hả?
Dạ.
Ok.
Chị Ninh nói.
Cái mà cái tiếp cận của tụi em khá là giống nhóm của thầy Tuấn, tức là
Well, our approach is similar to Tuan's group, so we don't have any solid answer or direct answer to Darren's questions. If we can only ask a single questions, we don't have to go to the enterprise to do that. I think that the questions to ourselves is more important. What kind of data we need to collect? And when we can answer this question, so what type of data we need, we will identify and we word the questionnaires and we decide the data sources and what is the research methods and the approaches and so on and so forth, what tools for data analysis, etc. For example, for skill forecast report for LIRC, and it is done by the Secretariat and the technical working groups. We have 2 questions. First one is the trends for logistic development in Vietnam in the future, and also the skills, the relevant skills that might be appropriate to meet with these trends. For these 2 questions, will guide the way we develop the questionnaires. So this is our discussion results. Maybe Ms. Hue and Mr. Viet and Mr. Mạnh can add to it, but that's all for me. Thank you. We are the same team, and I agree with Ms. Ning. So before we go into a survey or go to an interview, we have to decide the data we need from the survey, and that will shape the data sources. Where do we get the data, and what tools do we use to get the data? What tools do we use to analyze, and the size of the sample and the number of questions we put in the questionnaires, and the number of respondents, and the data. What will the data look like? For example, we have to envisage that. So it must start from the very basic questions. What data we want to get? Otherwise, we cannot develop an effective questionnaire, or the questionnaire is full of irrelevant questions, and it will create a survey fatigue. And when we collect the data, there are a lot of pieces of information that we do not use, and that will be a burden to the respondents. And maybe the respondents may refuse to meet us the next time we would like to do the survey, for example. So it must start from the type of data that we want.
Look, congratulations to Group 3. I think this is a very good response, very clever response, very much like Group 1. I think you've thought very laterally about what this whole process entails. And I think Ms. Ning and Ms. Hue make some very good points. We need to start with a research question, a research inquiry, a hypothesis. We need to think about what's the most appropriate tools that we can use. What's the data going to look like? I think Ms. Hue makes a very good point. Let's envisage, what is the data likely to look like? This is all part of the planning that we need to undertake. So I think the point that Ms. Ning made up front, that we want to ask ourselves some questions before we start, I think it's a very good way to think about this. And that's a good approach. Let's interrogate our own thinking. Let's investigate our own thinking about what we want from this. And then we can think about how and what it might look like and what way can we do it. That's the questions that flow from this initial planning inquiry. Look, I'm very impressed by all of the responses. I did ask you to come up with a question, and some of you have done that, which I'm very grateful for. And this is good. This is a good way to challenge your thinking about what is it that we're trying to find out? What is it that we want to know? And I hear the word skills, I hear demand, I hear change, what influences change. You're starting to think about these questions of inquiry. You're starting to frame these questions of inquiry. This is a good start. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring Kevin O'Leary in. And Kevin, you know, we were lucky to have Kevin join us last week. He's been kind enough to join us again today. And I'm sure he's got some, let's just say, thoughts maybe about what he's heard so far. And I'd be very interested, Kevin, if you have any comments on that exercise that we've just done. But welcome and thanks for joining us again. And I'll hand over to you now to maybe say a few words on that exercise and maybe give us some insights as well into some of the, I guess, approaches that we could be taking to administering survey tools as well. Welcome, Kevin, and thanks for joining us again.
Thank you, Darren, and thanks everybody for joining up again. Look, I found the questions quite interesting, and some of them, particularly the question around what are the impacts that technology will have on skills, and what is your solution? That is very similar to the research question that we have organizationally, which is basically around the two kind of base level questions that we have are essentially, what new skills do we not know about? How have those skills changed over time? And then what factors encourage or discourage training uptake? But that question on what new skills there are, our literal question is something along the lines of, have there been changes to occupations in the last year? Tell us what occupation and what are the skills. So we that's basically how we do it. So that's very similar. One of the other areas that I thought was interesting as well is, and I might touch on it a bit later on, but it's basically the idea of what questions do we ask of ourselves before we develop a survey. And I think maybe I'll get back to that. I've got a little bit to talk about in terms of survey administration. And the frame that I'm going to use in the discussion is basically trade-offs. The idea that obviously survey administration is at the end of the process, but what trade-offs do you need to bear in mind in the survey design? So some of the survey design components will have an effect on survey administration. And they will have an effect on those questions that you ask of yourself as you're entering into the survey design process. Basically, this has been alluded to a few times, and this actually came up as well as people were discussing what question to ask. There's two general types of questions. There's closed questions. Typically there, as Darren said, you want to test your knowledge, or you want to see how a known issue has changed over time. And then there's open-ended questions where what you want is new knowledge. What types of issues do people raise without prompting? Now, clearly there's a number of experienced people in the audience today, because that second question is obviously a very difficult one. And in terms of survey administration, it's the most burdensome administrative task by far. one of the ways that we think about what you might call a free text or the open-ended question is you ask those type of questions in an environment where you don't know something. You can use the results of a free text question in later years to later test your classification. So you can take a free text question in earlier years, categorize the results, and over the years convert it into a multiple choice question where you're discovering what has changed over time. So that's I think an important consideration when you're thinking of free text questions. Sometimes they're good in the beginning of a process where you don't have a lot of knowledge, and you can always convert them into closed-ended questions over time. In relation to that, the first trade-off I'd like to talk about is in relation to open-ended questions, and it's the difference between, or the trade-off between human analysis and computer-assisted analysis. Now, obviously, free text questions need to be categorized, they need to be classified, and you can either get a human being to do it, or you can rely on some sort of computer system. Depending on the choice that you make, I wouldn't even say depending on the choice that you make, depending on the circumstances of the survey, you might choose different options. So for example, if you're expecting a large number of responses, it's not practical to get humans to classify all that information. If, however, you're looking at a small number of high quality responses, so let's say you target enterprises and a small number of them, and within those enterprises, you're talking to managers or human resource managers, then you could have a small number of responses that a human being would do a much better job of categorizing. So basically, to me, the difference is around human classification. It gives you richer results. It's more nuanced. It can have some bias depending on the human being looking through the results. One of the, I guess the important aspects there is that human beings can classify information at different levels, which a computer cannot do. So they can identify different themes within groups, or they can identify larger themes that cut across the entire survey. So human beings, in my view, do a fantastic job of classifying information, but you're limited by that, by the quantity of survey results that you're expecting. Now, actually, I do have a little tip while you're doing that, because I've obviously done this kind of categorization. And that is, when you're categorizing, it is useful to group your results or to filter your results by certain entities in your data. So again, that might be, it could be enterprise or government, or it could be training organizations. And once you've grouped by the training organization, it becomes easier as a human being to identify what the key themes are for that group. Computer-assisted categorization is useful when you're talking about a high volume of survey responses. It works best if you have open-ended responses that are also short. So you certainly shouldn't give a computer a long survey response to deal with. And the other thing to remember as well is that they are totally, there's no context in terms of how a computer categorizes, classifies, and counts those results. So if you identify, for example, a word in a particular sentence that somebody has, the computer is just going to pull that word out and count it. It's not going to read the rest of the sentence. It's not going to understand the context that that word appeared in. In terms of AIS, we, again, depending on the type of survey, we use human classification when we're talking about those high quality, low volume surveys. We recently did a survey that had only 62 organizations out of, I think, 66. So we nearly covered all of the organizations, but the number of responses is quite small. And that was a lot of human categorization, because we were trying to tease out a lot of nuanced responses that people had given us. We also, however, have surveys where we have many hundreds of responses where categorization is not possible, but we're still looking for new information. We don't want to prompt the user to give us the answers that we already know. We're looking for new information. What we currently use is basically that text detection thing. So if you see a certain type of text, it gets categorized at a broader level. That, like I said, has major issues with context, which we're trying to get around. What we're currently looking into is a artificial intelligence supported categorization process, where you provide some human categorization to the artificial intelligence, and it understands to an extent the categorization process that the human went through, and it applies that same categorization to the remainder of text. So that future approach of using artificial intelligence might be a nice balance between, in terms of the trade-off, between the human generated categorization and the computer generated. The second trade-off I want to talk about is question sequencing. So this is something that Darren alluded to earlier on, and it's an important consideration. The trade-off is between the natural order that you want questions to appear in, or the natural order that you want selections to appear in a question, versus reducing bias. Now, for those of you that don't know, there is a common bias in survey results called first order bias. And what it basically means is that respondents who fill out surveys, they will, if you give them a selection of items to pick, there's a tendency to pick the first item most often, the second item second most often, third item third most often. So there's a selection bias. What we do in AIS is if we're giving people a multiple choice question, we randomize the results, and that minimizes the effect of that first order bias. Now, the same effect is going to be true to a certain extent when you're talking about the order of questions that you have. So in an ideal scenario, you would even randomize the order of questions. However, in our case, we feel that questions have a natural narrative structure. They have a natural order that they should come in. And knowing that, so again, coming back to the trade-off, we understand that fewer people will complete the whole survey. What that means, our response to that is to put the most important questions in the beginning. So if we've got some questions that aren't that important or are comparatively less important, we put them towards the end of the survey, because we know that fewer people will get through the whole survey. One of the major trade-offs in terms of your results, and I guess the way I would put this is the more detail you want in your data, the less certainty you have. So it's a very common temptation in surveys to ask a lot of questions and then to group your results based on those categories. So for example, if you've asked in your survey what industry sector somebody works in, how large the business is that they work in, and for example, in Australia's case, what state that business is located, you might think of looking for the skill needs of maritime occupations, of small businesses in South Australia. But the problem is, each time you add a parameter to your filter, you reduce the certainty in your results. You can look at any one of those parameters individually. So you could look at all of the businesses in a particular state, or all of the occupations in a particular industry, but stringing the parameters together in sequence means each time you add something, you reduce your results. Again, that depends enormously on how many occupations you have. So that, or sorry, how many responses you've had. So if you have many hundreds of responses, you can afford to cut the data down finer. But if you have a limited number of responses, your capacity to filter the data is much reduced. In terms of graphing, as in creating charts or that sort of thing, there's another trade-off, and that's something that we've been dealing with recently. And the trade-off for us is interactivity of charts versus static charts. So a static chart is just a picture, and an interactive chart is one that you can click on, you can identify data by moving your mouse around, you can zoom in on. The trade-off there really is in relation to engagement. So it's engagement and effort. So primarily AIS uses standard graphing software in Excel, but we've started to use Plotly, which is a platform that allows you to create online and interactive charts. I actually have an example of one here. I'm just going to place it in the chat so that you can have a look maybe later on. And you can see that there's a lot of interactive charts in here. But like I said, the trade-off is basically around how much effort, how much expertise and sophistication you need to develop interactive charts. They're significantly harder than putting together a standard chart. However, they do give you a lot richer picture of what's happening. There's also a trade-off, and Darren alluded to this a little bit earlier on as well, in terms of consistency of your questions over time. So on the one side of the trade-off, you've got keeping your questions identical or close to identical. That allows you to track the same parameters over time. However, on the other hand, you want to ask better questions every year. So that results in changing the questions to remove confusion or to remove questions that you feel are superfluous. An example that we have is we had a question where the problem that we had with it was that the questions that we were asking were too close in meaning. Now, we understood the difference between the two questions, but a lot of respondents didn't. So the questions were about skills shortages, which is basically asking, for example, in the case of an electrician, what new skills are needed for electricians, and then labor shortages, which is saying in a location, is there a shortage of electricians? But unfortunately, the way people understood the question, even though we explained the difference, they had their own interpretation of the question and answered them in a confusing manner. So we've simplified that down to just one question, which is the skill shortage question, and that is the one that we're interested in. The last trade-off I'd like to talk about is, again, something that Darren alluded to earlier on, and that's in relation to timing. So the trade-off is basically having a long period to allow for people to respond to a survey versus having that snapshot in time. That you know, the survey, particularly around COVID, you can imagine that the survey relates to a specific period of time. Now, the trade-off for us has been if we have too short of a survey period, and in Australian circumstances, too short can be 3 weeks. We get a lot of complaints that people didn't have enough time to respond. However, if you've got too long of a duration, like you said, Darren, you can have a circumstance where the data relates to a time period that's no longer current. In AIS's case, a lot of the timing for us is determined by the department of government that's responsible. And that again is determined by funding cycles within that department. So our survey typically occurs over Christmas, which is certainly not ideal for many industries. But in terms of our schedule, it's fairly unavoidable. One of the things that we do to improve the speed is we automate as much of the survey analysis as possible. So even the questions that are close-ended, we've got an automated process of we download the data, we rerun the analysis, and the charts and general analysis gets updated. So what it means is that while the survey is out, and as Darren said earlier on, most people respond, the most responses you'll get in the first week. And that's when we actually start our analysis. We download the table, we run the analysis, and basically what that allows you to do is to run the analysis while the survey is open. And it means that you can publish the results very soon after the survey has closed. And the facility that we use for that is a Microsoft-based application called Power Query, which is and for us anyway, an indispensable tool when it comes to administering surveys. I should mention as well, in case anybody's interested, I don't think I mentioned this, but the AI offering that we're looking at is, again, it's another Microsoft product called Power Apps, and the module is called Category Classification. And it's a reasonably, it's not very cheap, but it's a reasonably straightforward way of training AI. You certainly don't have to build AI. The artificial intelligence is a product. So returning to the original questions that we were talking about, there's a couple of questions that I think are certainly worth asking ourselves before you embark on the survey design. Which is, the first is, what kind of knowledge do we want? So are we testing existing knowledge or finding new information? That's probably the first question. So, because that will determine questions that should be open and questions that should be closed. The second question you should ask yourself is, how many survey responses do you expect? Now, that will mean the difference between, again, whether you have open or closed questions in case your resources aren't up to scratch, or whether you need to look at human categorization or computer-assisted categorization. And then the last question then is, how much sophistication do you have as a group in your analysis capacity? That applies to those computer-assisted categorization processes, which have their own spectrum of sophistication, from fairly basic to quite advanced. So I think those would be three important questions to ask yourself as you set off. So yeah, I think that's a general overview. I'm happy to take anybody's questions, or if anything came up that was of interest there, I'm happy to discuss further.
Thanks very much, Kevin. That's great. Really, I mean, very powerful overview, I think, of some of the issues we need to be considering. And it's really good to hear Kevin's endorsement, I think, of a couple of the points that were made in the groups. Let's be clear about the planning needs for this. Let's be very clear about the research query. What are we trying to find out? And as Kevin said, is it something that we don't know, or is it something that we're trying to test? Now's the chance to ask Kevin. We've got him here for the next 20 minutes still. So please, anyone want to raise any questions, make any comments, anything you'd like to say or anything you'd like to raise, now's the time. So please, it's open for you to ask any questions you wish. No? No questions yet?
Em có câu hỏi ạ.
I have a question. I have a question for Kevin.
Chuyên gia ông Kevin đã tham gia rất nhiều các cái
So many thanks to Kevin, and I believe that you are a seasoned expert. So can you share a little bit about your experience, the size of the sample? So how large is the size of the sample is appropriate for a survey on average?
So that will depend a little bit on the type of server that you've got. So for example, there's two different ways of conducting surveys. So, or well, there's many different ways, but two ways that you might categorize it are how you've taken the sample. So for example, in the Australian Bureau of Statistics, they run surveys that are based on random sampling. And random sampling is then used to say something about the general population. Now, random sampling is more it's a more expensive method. It definitely gives better results, and there's pretty decent numbers that you need around what size that sample should be in order to get a representative picture of what's going on in the population. In AIS's case, what we do is what's called convenience sampling. And convenience sampling is more around, you've got a database of stakeholders and you're questioning that database of stakeholders. Now, who you question in a survey is going to matter as well. So as I said earlier, one of the surveys that we've recently conducted is across all of the committees in the system that we have here in Australia. That's a different type of survey because it's much smaller, but the individuals that responded to that survey had a fairly broad range of what they were doing. They had fairly broad responses that they gave, and a lot of them were in depth. So it depends a little bit on how many stakeholders you have, the type of surveying that you're doing right in the beginning, whether it's randomized, which is quite expensive and sophisticated, or convenience sampling, which is more basic. So it depends on the type of survey that you want to do at the outset.
Very good. Any other questions that people would like to raise? Well, we've got Kevin here. Let me say something then, if there are no questions at this point. Look, I think in our case, well, in the case of the model that we're suggesting for Vietnam, we are essentially establishing or seeking to establish essentially the first data sets for what we understand to be the issues within the sector. So we're likely to be, I'm assuming, using a survey instrument to really find out things that we don't know already, I suspect. Now, I know in the case of the Secretariat to the LARC, there's been some planning around designing a survey instrument. So I wonder, Ms. Ning, if there's anything that you're hearing here today, which is influencing your thinking about the type of questions that we're likely to sort of ask in this first survey instrument. What are we trying to understand, do you think? Can I ask you, Ning, to maybe give us some thoughts on what it is that we think we're trying to understand from a survey instrument if we were to administer one to enterprises as the establishment of a baseline for our model?
Thật ra thì câu hỏi này nên hỏi anh Hải.
Well, actually, this question should be directed to Mr. Hải because he's the head of the technical team. But I would like to answer here, and Mr. Hải may support me. I have a convenient by AIS and Mr. Kevin O'Leary himself on a data collection method. And I'm preparing the plan for LIRC, and what I'm doing is based on what I learned from AIS. And so the question is that, are there any changes in the mindset? Well, there haven't been any changes because we didn't do it yet. We had the outline and I sent it to LIRC, and I collect back lots of feedback from LIRC members and as well as our sponsors and partners, and people appreciate that the idea of skill scanning and skill forecast, like an environmental scanning, environmental skill scanning for logistics. So it is basic, and it follows the process instructed to us by the Australian. So there must be an endorsement and the commission of LIRC. So we are in this stage. We are absorbing and incorporating the feedback from LIRC members and get more feedbacks from AIS and our partners to change our plan and to draft the first outline, and then we identify the questions and decide the data sources and the data collection method, just like the discussion result that I told you. So what type of data we want to put in this report, and what are the sources, and how can we get access to the sources, and which one we need to develop a survey to get the data. So this is the how question. On open or closed-ended questions, it depends on what we want to get. For example, jobs to be changed and new skill sets, for example, can be the open-ended questions of free text answer. But for the existing questions, for the existing situation, we may come with a closed questions. And we already established a technical working group, and we have the advisory board for the technical working group, like Professor Dr. Hua here, and from RMIT and AIS. You guys are always there to support us in our technical work. So I have many expectations and high hopes for this report. Maybe not very ambitious, because we don't have Kevin and everybody, the international experts here, so it's not as big as AIS, but I think that it will meet the basic demand of LIRC, the stakeholders and the industry, and that is our plan. And BCCI is working on this now. I pass on to Mr. Hai and Mr. Tuấn to have more addition. Well, Ms. Zhang, and they are the very active member of the technical working group. So Ms. Hua and Mr. Tuấn, yeah, the other members of the technical group.
Yeah, very good. Mr. Hai?
Hello, guys. So Ms. Ning just told you the as-is situation of the technical working group. We have a strong sense of solidarity among the technical working group, I have to say, and everything is based on the command and the order of LIRC. We will develop a structure to propose to LIRC, and when we get the for their consideration, they can cross out things or add up things. And when we get the decision from LIRC, we will carry on with that. Of course, we have many questions but we will ask Kevin later regarding the technical issues. Yeah, I believe this is very important. The overview now is easy and nice to hear, but I highly appreciate the work of Kevin, because I think it is a laborious and arduous task that you have over there. So highly appreciate.
Very true.
Very good comments, actually. I'm very, look, something I take from the two comments that have been made by Ms. Ning and Mr. Hai. What I'm impressed by is you are clearly thinking about what it is that we have to do to prepare to administer a good survey. And I think this is the most encouraging message I'm hearing from our discussion, is you are aware of some of these challenges and threats to getting good data, to getting useful data. So I think with that in mind, it's encouraging to hear that we are going to, really take a very close look at what it is we want to understand, who it is we need to consult with to get that information. And I can hear a lot of thinking around what are we going to do with this information. And I like what you said, Ning, earlier, that we don't want to be too ambitious. And I think that's really important for you guys at this stage of our development of the model. Let's, as I've said all along, let's build trust and confidence in the model. Let's start small. Let's take a staged approach. I think this is good thinking. This is in line with this approach. So I'm encouraged by that. Kevin, you want to say anything in response to the points that have been raised?
Yeah, I did notice another comment that's or another question that's come through as well, Darren, and I thought I might answer that one as well.
Yes.
So
Ms. Chung from VCCI, yep.
Yeah, so around how do we identify the right person in an organization to answer the survey. So that again will differ depending on the size of your survey. If you have a large survey where there's hundreds of people responding, the understanding is that on average, you will get decent responses. Some of them will be very good and some of them will be very poor, but on average, you will get decent responses. And that's obviously true for no matter what type of survey you do, but in terms of the randomized surveys that, like I said earlier on, were a bit more sophisticated, there's a little bit of interesting mathematics behind that, where if you have a randomized survey of the right size, the average result in that survey is broadly representative of the average for the whole population. So that's the mathematical underpinning for those randomized surveys. The other one then is the more targeted surveys, where you're trying to identify who the right person is within an organization. So in Australia's case, for large organizations, that's fairly straightforward. There's a human resource manager is typically aware of recruitment, hiring, the skills gaps that exist. You might have, for example, if you're targeting training organizations, you might see, again, trainers who understand what skills students have, or the kind of skills that students will have once training is complete. It depends on kind of the question that you're trying to ask, but it's never going to be perfect. You're just hoping that it's good enough. So with large organizations, you'll have your human resource managers, whereas with small organizations, you might be talking to one guy who is the owner, manager, human resources, and whatever else. The hope really is that or I guess the understanding is that most of the resources, or most of the people you talk to, will be about right, with some fantastic responses and some not so good.
Very good. Any other questions? Well, we've got Kevin here for the next 5 minutes. Looks like Chung was happy with your response, Kevin, so that's good. Anyone else like to say anything? Any comments? Doesn't have to be a question. Any comments? I know that many of you are very familiar with survey instruments and use survey instruments, so it'd be good to hear, you know, any observations that you've got on what's been presented today.
Mr. Hai has a question.
Yes, Mr. Hai, please go ahead.
Kevin, could you share a little bit about the way that you validate the feedback, the information? You just told in your presentation that you will randomize the question or the feedback, but is that you have the software to help you to get the back information, or by your hand? So just share a little.
Yeah, so that's it's built into the survey tools these days, which is great. So we've used different survey tools. So primarily we use SurveyMonkey, which is pretty quick and easy, and that has a little item that you just select. So as you put your question together, you can select, randomize the responses. That makes life much easier. What we typically do, so SurveyMonkey has some basic charting functionality as well. We never use that. So we always, once the survey is over, we download the data and then we run our process over the top of that. Like I said, we use Power Query, which I certainly find useful. And one of the benefits, actually, I was talking earlier on about, you know, the benefits to keeping some questions the same and varying other questions. One of the other benefits is once you build the analysis automation, if you keep your questions the same, not only do you see what changes occur to the same parameters, you can use almost the same automation machinery the next year. So it reduces your burden further. And particularly where that's been useful for me is in terms of the text categorization. So the first year I did that, it took me weeks because I was, you know, coding in all of the categorization. Whereas the second year I did it, I categorized maybe 70 or 80% of it automatically. And that final 20%, I was again doing my coding, and each year that little percentage got smaller and smaller and smaller. So now it's like people rarely input something that the categorization doesn't pick up. So that's an important kind of consideration to bear in mind, as well as those first couple of years where you're doing your categorization can take a lot of work, but it pays off over time, especially if you automate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
And this, I think, is going to be one of our challenges, is we're establishing this model. As we build confidence capability, we can look to be more, I guess, ambitious with our data parameters, maybe our lines of inquiry, and maybe some of the data collection methods that we're using. But we're really starting from an establishment base here. So we need to be really careful about taking on too much, I guess. Keeping it manageable, keeping it simple, keeping it at a level that our resource capacity can manage. But of course, we've got some very good partners in our network. Some of the vet colleges, we've got, you know, the Research Institute, which has already done a lot of this work previously. So we do have good partnerships that we can bring into this process. But I think I'm encouraged by what I've heard today from some of the comments here, that there is a clear understanding of the need for a really clear sense of what it is we're looking for. There's a good understanding of the need for the preparatory work to be done well. When we get to next week and we start to look at how we do the analysis and interpretation of data, I'm sure it'll generate some more thinking around how we actually design this survey instrument, because you'll start to see what it is that we can draw from the information and how we're going to use that information. And that, as Kevin has said, will influence, you know, what it is we're trying to find out and the approach that we'll take. All right, any last questions for Kevin? This is the chance to have one more question before we wrap up. Is there anyone out there that would like to make a comment? Mr. Viet, I see you have your hand up. Please, Mr. Viet.
Dạ vâng, xin chào anh Kevin cùng tất cả.
Good morning, Kevin, and hello to everyone, my fellow classmates. From the presentation of Kevin, we learned a lot of lessons here. And my question for you is that when we are administering the survey and collect the data, and in the data analysis, there will be contradictory pieces of information crops up. So in case, how can you identify the invalid pieces of information, and how do you decide the usage for this piece of data? Can it be used or not? Is it valid or not? Yeah.
So we would typically operate around what is the most, actually there's probably an important consideration here right at the outset. When you're talking about a survey, the important thing to remember is the results that you're going to get are basically, it's a distribution of opinions. Now, the way we think about that is what we're looking for, where you're going to have people who disagree about things. And sometimes that disagreement is dependent on the organization that they come from and who's paying them. But the way we think about it is if you've got your distribution of opinions, we like to find, well, what's the most common opinion here? So yeah, so that's how we think about it. Again, with the categorizations, we might talk about, you know, in the main, people thought about this a certain way, and some people were extreme in this way, and some people were extreme in that way. But in general, we try to stick to the middle.
Thank you very much. Okay, look, we might conclude our session for today here. And thank you very much, Kevin, for joining us again. I know you're very busy, so we're very grateful that you've made time again for us. I thought it was really interesting what you had to say. You clearly know your stuff around surveys. And look, I suspect, and the hope is that as we continue on this journey together with our colleagues, that we may get you back in again to help with some of this, the evolution of this process as it evolves over the next 6 months. So look, I'm very grateful for the time that you've been able to spare with us over 2 weeks. So I want to thank you on behalf of our training group for that. I also want to thank all our participants again for another very engaged and very constructive discussion. That concludes our second module on collecting data. And what we're going to move into next week is how we do the analysis and interpretation of the data. On Tuesday, I'm going to show you a bit of the systems and processes that we use within AIS. And then on Wednesday, we're going to start to look at how we present the data. What do we do with it? How do we package it? How do we disseminate? We're going to look on Thursday at the dissemination channels. We've got a communications expert from our team, Gail Holmick, will join us. And on Wednesday, Leanne Mundy will join us on technical writing and the use of discussion papers. So we've now gone from module 1, the conceptual understanding. We've moved into the data collection options and processes. And I think you've got a sense of what those options might be and could be applicable for Vietnam. And now we're going to move into what do we do with the data? How do we make sense of it? How do we package it? How do we present it? So please join us again starting on Tuesday next week for our last week of training. Thank you once again for your very active participation. And I very much look forward to seeing you again next Tuesday. Thanks to you all, and I wish you good health and good luck until then.
Thanks all.
Thank you all. Tạm biệt.
Bye.